Okay, I think we'll get started here. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joanne Knowlton Gabriel, and on behalf of the Darien Library, we welcome you to our program this afternoon, New York National Historic Sites and the History They Tell with Alan Despres. Alan returns for part 4 of this 8-part series to talk about the Hamilton Grange, the final home of Alexander Hamilton. Located in New York City, Hamilton Grange is in the northernmost part of West Harlem in an area called Hamilton Heights. Before we begin, I would like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this possible and our collections available to the community. Our presenter this afternoon has been a seasoned lecturer of programs about our national parks and historic locales for over 20 years, focusing on important issues of universal and American values. A retired United States Park Ranger, he has delivered speeches to American and international audiences about famous sites such as Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty, Grant's Tomb, and Federal Hall, to name a few. Please welcome Alan Despres.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. I guess this is the fourth presentation on the Park Service and the sites in this area. And today we'll be talking about Alexander Hamilton. And as it says in the subtitle, a great American finance, law, and the Constitution. And he also had some experience on the battlefield as well. He was an immigrant from the West Indies, and we'll talk about that as we go along, and where specifically he came from. He worked his way up fairly quickly, and eventually became Secretary of the Treasury. And he also was a well-known lawyer. He was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention. He fought very hard to get the Constitution ratified. And we'll talk about that as we go along as well. And here he is, probably in his 30s. January 11, 1755, he was born in the British island of Nevis in the West Indies. Second of 2 boys, his father, James, was a Scottish trader of noble ancestry. His mother, Rachel Fawcett, was of French Huguenot descent, and was married actually to another man at the time. So Hamilton was born illegitimate, and that some accounts say that it was 1757 and not 1755. So there you go. That's St. Kitts and Nevis. And in 1765, they moved to the Danish island of St. Croix. And that was to eventually become part of the United States Virgin Islands. These were all slave holding areas, and the biggest crop was sugarcane. Europeans had a sweet tooth, and it was a very big business at the time. As it says here, there was over 120 sugar plantations in these islands. Those specific, Nevis, St. Croix, etc. And there were many more in the other islands as well. I don't know when this was done. It was the recent one, but it's an artist's rendition of the wharf at St. Croix. And this is the place where Alexander worked as a young man. He was fairly young when he started clerking there at the counting house. It was owned by one of the partners with Nicholas Kruger. He was to be important in Hamilton's life. We'll get into that in a moment as well. One of the things, of course, that he dealt with, the counting house dealt with, one of the products, if you want to use that term, when you're talking about human flesh, and that would be slave ships and enslavement. So as we go through these pictures, Alexander Hamilton would have seen these. He would have seen slave auctions. He would have seen the enslaved in chains. Plantations were all around. Enslavement is a big part of the story of the Manhattan sites. Almost all of them do reflect this reality. And this would be how a slave ship was set up at the time. As you can see, packed in there, and it is even worse. Here's another vision. If you can imagine actually having to cross the Atlantic Ocean, which took months at the time, a long time, in this kind of condition. You very rarely were released from that on the ship. That was very rare, especially for the males. Now, this is the sugar plantation, very gruesome work and heat, great deal of heat, working all day. Lifespan wasn't very long. And this is very gruesome, but this says there's an iron mask and collar, excuse me for the misspelling, used by slave holders to keep their field hands from running away, especially in the Sugar Islands. So there's actually a photograph from the South in the 19th century of an enslaved man wearing one of these collars. The mask was very difficult to get off. It could start tearing your flesh if it wasn't done properly. And here we go again, working in the fields. So this was a big business at the time. And like I said, this was a very lucrative trade in the 18th century. Here's another example of the enslavement in working in the sugar house. And again, sugar canes, that process, the heating, etc., that was done. The sugar mill. Now, we're going to, I guess, go ahead pretty quickly in the next, because you're going to see a picture of King's College, or what was the future of Columbia University. The gentleman that Alexander Hamilton worked for and a group of merchants were very much impressed by Alexander Hamilton. And I believe he wrote an article for the local journal about a great big hurricane that had happened in the islands. And they were so impressed by his abilities that they decided to get together and send him to grammar school in New Jersey. I guess I didn't read that, but since he went to King's College in 1774, obviously he applied there, and obviously they were going to continue paying for it. So that's how he got to the United States, the colonies, just before the American Revolution, and he never left. And he rose up from there. In 1774, while he was in college, at the university, he wrote a full vindication of the measures of Congress. And it says, of course, Congress has the right to boycott Great Britain, and it is signed a friend of America. So it was the first of his many writings on the political events of the day. He was a full supporter of the American Revolution and the break from Great Britain. So right off the bat, he started to give himself a name. One of the interesting things about it says May 10th, 1775. While he was at the college, just before he left, really, because the revolution made that impossible, since he was going to become a soldier and then an aide to George Washington, the president of King's College was attacked by a mob. He was a Tory, and they were going to drag him out of the college and probably tar and feather him. Alexander Hamilton, who, as I said, was a full supporter of the American Revolution and was already making a name for himself, he was assumed to help protect the battery as an artillery officer. Not too far from this time, and he stopped the mob attacking. He went out in front and said, "This is not the right thing to do," and he kept talking, and he delayed them long enough, and they knew who he was, so that the president, Miles Cooper, could escape. He got on a British ship, I believe, and went to England, and he remained a Tory, of course, all his life. So Alexander Hamilton did not like mobs. He did not like chaos. he was like most of the founding fathers who did not like that at all. So he thought a mob would soon break out and no one could control it and would go after not only people who groups that were against the revolution, but also men of property. Later on, Alexander Hamilton was also going to defend, after the revolution, some of the Tories whose property was not returned to them. Very interesting gentleman. So, and he took the case of many of them, as a matter of fact, but that was after the revolution. Now we bring up George Washington and the strategy used at the time. And best way to say it was what in George Washington's own words: "We should on all occasions avoid general action or put anything to the risk unless compelled by a necessity into which we ought never to be drawn." So you don't come into a direct battle with an offensive unless you could do it. If the risk was lessened, you might try it. But if not, you knew how to retreat and come back another day. Opt for small-scale improvisational skirmishes, the very sort of mobile, risk-averse war of attrition. Now, Hamilton had written an article already expounding the same strategy, and he continued, like George Washington, to believe in its necessity, though sometimes he thought that was too slow, and maybe George Washington needed a little pushing. Okay. Let's see. The only way to defeat the British and to gain independence was by hanging upon the rear, and this is his direct quote, and seizing every opportunity of skirmishing. British opposition would be rendered insupportable and uneasy. The rugged terrain and dense forest of America would make it difficult for the British to wage conventional warfare, and that turned out to be true. Now, after George Washington and the American Loyalists had to retreat from New York City, they were crossing the Raritan River near New Brunswick, New Jersey. I know that area well. And Hamilton was an artillery officer already, and he posted with cannon on the riverbank, high riverbank, and provided cover for the retreating patriots. So he made it possible for them to get across. It was reported that George Washington was, quote, charmed by the brilliant courage and admirable skill as he directed a battery against the enemy's advanced columns that pressed upon the Americans in their retreat by the ford. Now, praising Alexander Hamilton, George Washington sent a report to Congress, and he said that smart cannonade allowed his men to escape. So he was much impressed by Alexander Hamilton. So here he was. He had the full notice of the father of the country, later called so, George Washington. So there you go. And they were very close, though they did have a falling out later on, but still they got to be back together again. And Hamilton believed George Washington was one of the greatest Americans, and the war wouldn't have been a success without him. And he helped them a great deal when he was president as well, George Washington, that is. A couple of battles that Hamilton was in, Princeton, and that battle was a success. They were able to get away, and it raised the morale of the troops. And again, George Washington recognized Hamilton's abilities, and on January 20th, 1777, wrote him after Princeton and invited him to join the staff as an aide, and he joined in March of that year. Okay, 1778, he was still actively in battles. And here's another one, the Battle of Monmouth. He had his horse shot out from under him, though the figure on horse is George Washington. And here we go again. And supposedly that's Alexander Hamilton right behind George. I think it's the man with the the helmet and the fringe on the top, because there is a painting of George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, done probably in the 19th century, but he is in that attire. I bring this up because I think it's rather interesting. Just a comment, and people can take it where they want. Smallpox in the American Revolution, and in 1775, there was some evidence that the British had introduced smallpox in the Continental forces who were laying siege to Boston and those entering into Boston after Evacuation Day. And so during the first year of the Revolutionary War, Washington's tactics of isolating army patients of smallpox didn't stop it, the disease. So it was causing more deaths of the Continental troops in 1776 than died in battlefield. So in his direct words, I have therefore determined not only to inoculate all the troops now here and have not had it, but shall order doctors to inoculate the recruits as fast as they come into Philadelphia. George Washington, February 5th, 1777. And I believe smallpox was one of the first diseases controlled by inoculation. That's something to look into. I believe it was the earlier part of the 18th century. So that would have been the first inoculations done to prevent a disease. So Washington did it in secret, or didn't want the word to get out because he thought the British would hear about it and attack. But before the end of 1777, 40,000 troops had been inoculated in the year following the start of mass inoculation. The infection rate from smallpox in the Continental Army fell from 17% to 1%. So that's an interesting sideline. Also, we're jumping ahead just for a moment, and this is the great yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia in 1794. Out of a population, I believe Philadelphia had about 30,000 people, 5,000 people died from smallpox. And of course, they used the idea of quarantining people and having certain sections of the city under quarantine so it wouldn't spread. And of course, all the government at the time, because Philadelphia was the capital, left, and so did those who could, so that they wouldn't be part of that ongoing plague. So that was going to be a problem for many years as time went by, yellow fever amongst others. Now, getting back to our narrative, here, Alexander Hamilton, and this is his oath to become an aide de camp to George Washington. And here he promises to defend the United States against said King George III, his heirs and successors, and his or their abettors, assistants and adherents, and will serve the United States in the office of aide de camp. And that was for General Washington. Now, excuse me, this was kind of caused a problem eventually for Alexander Hamilton because it gave him a lot of paperwork and he was not involved in battles. He had to do special projects and paperwork for George Washington. And George Washington often put him in charge of problems that needed to be solved in the military, administratively wise. And it was often heard in wherever he had his headquarters when there was a problem to be solved, get Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton had ideas constantly about taking care of day-to-day operations in governance and solutions as well. So that was an ongoing call. Now, as an example of how George Washington was dependent on him as an aide above other aides, he often asked Alexander Hamilton to draw up scenarios for joint military operations with French and the French fleet, which had just landed off of Newport in 1780. Of course, that came a little bit down the road. And also, he got the Washington's meeting with Rochambeau at Hartford in late December. Now, at that time, George Washington and Alexander Hamilton had a big argument. Seems one day George Washington, who was known to have a temper, had told Alexander Hamilton to meet him on the top of the stairs over some business that had to be done. Either Alexander Hamilton didn't hear him or didn't think it was that vital. So George Washington was very angry and let it be known with no uncertain terms. That caused Hamilton to resign. He had also wanted a commission to fight again, to be given a command. And George Washington had said no all these years because he needed him so much. Excuse me just a minute. So that was the big fallout. George Washington apologized. Alexander Hamilton didn't accept it, but he did get his commission, and it was made up as time went by. And so they worked closely together on many things after that fact. But as Chernow said, who wrote the biography of Hamilton, things were never the same again. They were not quite as close, but they still had a high opinion of each other and worked together very well. Just an example of some of George Washington's headquarters. Alexander Hamilton would be there. I think the stone building is at, I didn't think of the name right now. I was going to say Yorktown, but it's not. Morristown, I believe. And the white building, I believe, is also in New Jersey. So you'll have to forgive me about that. Anyway, I thought it'd be interesting. And George Washington is sitting outside having a conference with some of his aides in front of the building. Now, even though the Revolutionary War was going on and Hamilton was a great ladies' man and very much interested in the young ladies around him. For a while, he flirted with Angelina Schuyler and also Kitty Morrison, excuse me. And so that was going to cause a problem at other times. There was scandals about him later on with his extramarital affairs, especially in the 1790s, or at least one famous one. But we really won't be getting into that. But Angelina Schuyler was actually Elizabeth Schuyler's sister. And Elizabeth Schuyler was going to be the woman he fell in love with. Anyway, I guess this sort of got in here. That's at the Grange. That's the museum that's there. I believe, so anyone who wants to travel over there and take a look at the Grange, and I hope you do, will get to take a look there as well. Now, Alexander Hamilton gets his commission. And so this is Yorktown. American forces led by the Marquis de Lafayette and Alexander Hamilton, they stormed the redoubt during the 1781 Battle of Yorktown. It tells you where the painting hangs. It was painted by Eugene Louis Lamy in 1840. So this was a 19th century painting. So he finally got his wish, and he did lead them in battle. And unfortunately, that was short-lived because the war was soon over. Now, 1780, he fell deeply in love with Elizabeth Schuyler. And here's some of the requirements, I guess, that he looked for in a potential love match. She must be young, handsome, and he says, I lay most stress upon a good shape, sensible, a little learning will do, well-bred, chaste and tender. I am an enthusiast in my notions of fidelity and fondness, of some good nature, a great deal of generosity. She must neither love money nor scolding, for I dislike equally a termagant and an economist in politics. Now, I don't know what the economist means. I am indifferent what side she may be of, and he's talking about politics. I think I have arguments that will safely convert her to mine. As to religion, a moderate stock will satisfy me. She must believe in God, but hate a saint, And as fortune, the larger stock of that, the better. Well, at least he's pretty honest about it. Elizabeth Schuyler came from a very wealthy family. Her father had been a general during the Revolutionary War. I believe he also became governor of New York. So it was a well-to-do family. And she was born in Albany, New York. Her family was one of the richest. And when they did marry, Hamilton and Elizabeth had 8 children. I threw this in. This is the Schuyler Mansion in Albany. I love you too much, Alexander writes Elizabeth. You engross my thoughts too entirely to allow me to think of anything else. And so I put the heart here. And then these 2 paintings are of Alexander Hamilton and Elizabeth, as you can see in the Schuyler Mansion. And just a few pictures of the mansion itself inside. And there is a watercolor of it down on the lower hand and right, the upstairs hall, which they probably used as a ballroom, the drawing room, etc. So this is the family she came from. Post-revolution. Before we go on to that, while Alexander Hamilton was an aide to George Washington, he used to come up with all kinds of ideas for the future and how America, especially the future American government, should look. And one of the biggest problems was under the Continental Congress and later on the Articles of Confederation, that the Congress did not have the right to tax. So all the monies that they got from the states were voluntary. And that was to be a big problem. So he actually dreamed up a 12-point program for a financial system on how to get it money, how to issue it, how to get public and private loans. Morris was the Secretary of Finance for the Congress, Continental Congress, and he was in agreement with Hamilton's many ideas. Hamilton actually sent him a report all on his own, and he was very much impressed by it. So the American Revolution was a practical workshop of economic and political theory, and Hamilton went to town writing many-page reports on how you should solve some of the problems. He also believed that Congress and the national government needed to be supreme over the states in, quote, and his speech, quote, war, peace, trade, finance, and foreign affairs. So all those ideas were working around in Alexander Hamilton's brain. After the Revolution, he became a lawyer. He did that in a couple of years and was able to become a very successful one. He had not been able to finish his university education, and so he had to start really much from scratch to become one of the most competent lawyers of the time. A couple of things about the future Constitutional Convention. He was a big supporter of, as I said, strengthening the federal government, and he believed that structure was the most important thing of all, and of course a national government superior over the states. But he was a very practical man, and after being a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, in fact, the speech that he made and some of his ideas were a little too extreme for the convention in 1787. One of the things he said is that a president should stay president on good behavior, so that there should be no limit to his time there. So that didn't go, because there was always shall we say, the fear amongst the American revolutionaries and the Constitutional Convention delegates and all the big guys, that you didn't want a king again, and that sounded too much like monarchy. So it is not time to awake from the, is it not time, excuse me, to awake from the deceitful dream of a golden age and to adopt as a practical maxim for the direction of our political conduct that we, as well as the other inhabitants of the globe, are yet remote from the happy empire of perfect wisdom and perfect virtue. So don't expect perfection. Don't expect the government that's going to come along and to make a paradise on earth all of a sudden, or even after a long time. But the structure was very important. How you balance liberty and order. And that was a big thing with Hamilton, Madison, George Washington, maybe not so much Thomas Jefferson. But this is the underpinnings of a really democratic republic. And how democratic it should be, of course, was open to debate and has changed over the years. And this is, they didn't say what Federalist paper that was before. I mean, I didn't get anyway, Federalist Papers number 6. Now, the Federalist Papers were one of the most brilliant documents on government. And Alexander Hamilton wrote most of them. Madison second, and Jay, the third one, only a couple. Madison, I believe, did quite a few, but it was still, in a large part, though Madison was very important as well, Alexander Hamilton's baby. Has commerce hitherto done anything more than to change the objects of war? Is not the love of wealth as domineering and enterprising a passion as that of the power of glory? So actually, one of the things he's saying there is that you need to have prosperity, wealth. That's a big passion, and it's not necessarily bad. It's a thing that makes people support a government as well as rights, civil rights, and popular rights. Are not popular assemblies frequently subject to the impulses of rage, resentment, jealousy, avarice, and other irregular and violent propensities? So the mob is no good. So that's another belief that I've been talking about as well. So too much liberty isn't too good either. And so that's two sides of his nature. Constitutional Convention, that's just a picture of the Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And again, there's all the delegates. Now, Alexander Hamilton went back and forth. So his influence there wasn't as great in the convention itself. Afterwards, yes, because no one worked harder to get the Constitution accepted. And of course, here are the Federalists, a collection of essays written in favor of the new Constitution. This means that the state assemblies, legislatures, had to approve. They had special, well, actually, they had special constitutional conventions, so delegates were elected for the sole purpose of voting on the Constitution. Now, this is a speech that he made before the New York Ratifying Convention. When you assemble with your several counties in the legislature, were every member to be guided only by the apparent interest of his county, government would be impractical. So if you're just thinking of the local, that's not good. There must be a perpetual accommodation and sacrifice of local advantage to general expediency. So there are times when the general good is more important than the local. And that's pretty much one of the bases of a national government, a nation state, that sometimes the local interests may have to, shall we say, back down a bit over the national practicality and the national good. Ship of state, they called this boat Hamilton, and that's one of the parades in New York after the ratification, celebrating that there was a new government. And getting back to the new government, George Washington, of course, was elected the first president with no opposition. And here is his first cabinet. Washington's Secretary of State was Thomas Jefferson. Secretary of the Treasury was Alexander Hamilton. And now, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton disagreed about how this new government should work. Alexander Hamilton, he wanted sound financial policies. He wanted the merchants and the investors to support the government and to invest in the United States. And he wanted I guess today we would say an industrial state. Maybe that's an old-fashioned term, but one where prosperity is based on business and finance. Thomas Jefferson believed that America should be an agrarian society of small farmers. And he was always fighting for that idea. Merchants, money, too much influence, especially if there was a strong executive who gave out largesse, gave government contracts, etc. And so he was very leery of that. Just a downer on that, he didn't seem, he was opposed, he said, to slavery, in the Declaration of Independence. Of course, that famous document declares that all men are created equal. But this problem of slavery, where a free nation, many people are enslaved, was a problem he didn't know how to solve. And this is Hamilton's report on public credit of the United States. And that's one of the things he did as Secretary of the Treasury, a sound financial program. And when George Washington became president, 1789, with his Secretary of the Treasury, the economic foundation of the United States, the program that Hamilton presented and proselytized and worked for and got, of course, the approval of George Washington and the Congress eventually, was the federal assumption of state debts. And Hamilton thought that by doing that, and states like Virginia complained, and these debts were from the Revolution. Virginia said, among the other southern states, that they had paid their debts off. Massachusetts might have as well, but some of the other states had not. So why should they help to pay off the debts of the other states? Well, Alexander Hamilton, this is a nation. Everybody is involved in this. It will unite us and bring us together and support the government. And so that made some of the, shall we say, later on, they were called Democratic Republicans, very leery. They wanted not too much power in the federal government. James Madison, who was big on the Constitution and the strong executive, etc., changed his mind and became much more to Thomas Jefferson's side than anything else. This is one of the things that caused quite a problem, because Hamilton wanted a Bank of the United States, and that, of course, was something that Thomas Jefferson was very much opposed to. And here is the bank, I believe, in the early 1800s. And according to Hamilton, here's one of his quotes. There'll be some more coming along. Industry is increased. Commodities are multiplied, agriculture and manufacturers flourish, and herein consists the true wealth and prosperity of a state. How does that happen? By those with money investing in industry with a sound money policy of a national government that they could depend on, who paid its bills and paid interest on this Bank of the United States. National debt, and the big deal about funding a debt. You can invest in that and you get interest on it. And obviously, that's what many of the merchants and the financiers wanted to do at the time. So a national debt, and I believe the national debt from the Napoleonic Wars, or even further from the 7 Years' War in Great Britain, was just paid off just a few years ago. So that kind of funding, that kind of servicing of a debt, which made a nation prosperous, was one of the things that Alexander Hamilton was talking about. But according to Thomas Jefferson, I sincerely believe that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies. No way, too much influence, too much money, etc. Interestingly enough, the slaveholding population of the South, the plantation owners, were the most prosperous and wealthiest group in the country all the way into the Civil War. So that's rather an interesting sideline there. Now we get into slavery and an advertisement for a runaway slave. And interestingly enough, I believe this is the Constitution or the main document of the New York Manumission Society, founded amongst others, but it was John Jay's idea, but founded in 1785 by John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, the most famous members of it. And their purpose was to end slavery gradually, stop the slave trade. And so Alexander Hamilton, by what he saw as a child and young man on St. Croix, pretty much touched him for life. He was very much opposed to slavery. Now, this was a group of white men, and they were wealthy white men. They were not like abolitionists who came later, but there were some at the time, believed in complete civil rights for the enslaved. They said that the enslaved, once they were set free, were not to be sent to Liberia, which became a nation. That's one of the ideas of the Manumission Society, that once they were free, the former enslaved would then leave the country and make a society of their own. Not all of the Manumission Society members believed that, but many did. So there's a big difference between future abolitionists and the ones who believed in more gradual slavery, ending of slavery, and also believe that the future unenslaved, those that are set free, were not on the same level as, let's put it bluntly, white people. So that was going to be a continuing problem as well. But basic bottom line, and this is Alexander Hamilton again, who talks most about freedom and equality. Is it not those who hold the Bill of Rights in one hand and a whip for affrighted slaves in the other? And that's what many of the slaveholders in the South, especially in the South, there were plenty in the North as well, not as many. They were carrying on about, they didn't want to be enslaved. Great Britain was making them slaves. But where their own enslaved came in, that was something that didn't pertain. How they were able to make that distinction, it might be hard for us to understand, but they did. And that, of course, was based on economics, but also racial fears as well. So Alexander Hamilton, bottom line, those people who cry the most about freedom and equality often were slaveholders. Let's see, a full vindication of the measures of Congress. That was written by Alexander Hamilton, and it compared enslaved people and colonists oppressed by the British. Just what I was talking about. Many colonials, especially slaveholders, said, oh, our rights are being trampled upon. We have the rights of Englishmen. But they did not talk about the enslaved. In 1779, Alexander Hamilton, he had a plan with his friend John Lawrence to arm and enlist the enslaved people, or some, in the Continental Army, and then they'd get their freedom. And also, he said, the dictates, of humanity and true policy equally interest me in favor of this unfortunate class of men. Now, one of the things that the Manumission Society did was founding the New York African Free School. And here is a history of it. And there is the building. I think that was the second one. So that wouldn't have been around in the 1790s. And then this idea was to gain some force, and that was a nation made in Africa for the unfreed slaves. This is from 1848, but it's still that idea, and Liberia was set up as an independent nation, and slaves and the freed slaves, some of them did, but the enslaved in the United States, once they were free, the majority did not want to leave the United States. But it was their country as well as anyone else's, and not in Africa. Rather interesting. Did I do that twice? No. Now, one of the things that Alexander Hamilton helped to create, because he was Secretary of Treasury, was the Coast Guard. So there you go. And there is the symbol in 1790. Now, a couple of things in the 1790s. Alexander Hamilton, the first report on public credit, and that's the assumption of state debts. We already went over that. Now, he couldn't get the votes for it. And Thomas Jefferson was opposed, and so was Madison. Because again, if you get the states dependent on the United States for their debts and servicing those debts with people investing all over the country, including the South, in the economy of this new nation, more power would ensue to the federal government. So it was decided that Alexander Hamilton wanted New York as the capital of the United States, but the Southerners did not. They wanted a district in the South for the new city. So they wanted it so badly, and Hamilton wanted his federal assumption of the state debts so badly that Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton and Madison got together at a dinner one night, and the assumption had failed, and so they decided to work on it again, and that's where you get Washington, D.C. in exchange for Southern votes for the assumption plan. And so it happened, and a month later, the House passed a bill making Philadelphia the temporary capital, and the permanent one would go to the Potomac, the District of Columbia. So there you go. And then, of course, the big bone in conflict in the United States in the 1790s was the national bank, the Bank of the United States. And I'm not going to go into that, but this, of course, would concentrate more power in the hands. So it was a private bank with government representation on it, but it did all the things that helped government finance itself. And so Madison and Jefferson, again, the forces of finance against agrarian society. So that big fight over the bank, and it did pass easily, actually started the party system in the United States. Those for the bank were Federalists. Those against were Democratic Republicans, and they were headed by Jefferson and then later Madison. Okay. And here, of course, is the drawing of the White House. That's probably by Latrobe, I believe. And then this is the Capitol building in 1800. Just one section was put up by that. And other events of note in the 1790s, proclamation of neutrality between Britain and Great France and France. The United States would be neutral. The French Revolution had started. It got violent. Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans were pro-French, pro-revolution. The Federalists were pro-British. Of course, that's an oversimplification as well. But anyway, the suppression in 1794 of the Whiskey Rebellion over a federal excise tax on whiskey. And actually, the troops were raised, and that was the first and only time that a president led troops. There was no battle. The rebels gave up very easily. But the federal right to have a tax, a government tax on the locally, etc., over a product in the United States was pretty much to be accepted. He resigned as Secretary of the Treasury in 1795. He helped Washington work on the farewell address, and of course, famous "No entanglements with foreign affairs, remain neutral." Election of 1796. The candidate was Adams on the Federalist side, Jefferson on the other. Hamilton didn't like Adams. He said he wasn't, what's the word? He should never be president. He didn't have the abilities to be so, and he wanted the Federalists to vote for Thomas Pinckney. It backfired. The New England Federalists said no way, and Jefferson, Adams' political rival, became vice president, and Adams won. So it didn't work. Hamilton was foiled there. Okay, in a private letter for the 4 years later, the election of 1800, he said Hamilton wrote that he was unfit for the office of chief magistrate. Adams was running again. Hamilton wrote a pamphlet for private distribution to leading Federalists, again saying, Adams, do not re-elect him. Go for Pinckney again. Burr, who was running with Jefferson, discovered that, made it public, split the Federalist Party, and that was pretty much responsible for a tie, 73 to 73, thrown into the House of Representatives. House decides for Jefferson. Hamilton backs Jefferson, hates him, but considers Burr the most dangerous man in America. Burr, he believes, has no principles, public or private. Now, Saturday Evening Post was founded by Alexander Hamilton, amongst others, but he's the most famous, and that, I believe, existed till 1925. I believe the New York Post claims that's how that is really them, and that's just a continuation of the original New York Evening Post. Now, because of, shall we say, Hamilton's dislike of Burr, their disagreements, their underhanded conflict with each other, they were to fight a duel. And so that's what happened. Interestingly enough, this was in 1804, so we're jumping over quite a bit. But Alexander Hamilton's son, just a year or so before that, had died in a duel fighting over his father's reputation, defending him. So perhaps Alexander Hamilton, when Burr said, you've insulted me, I want an apology, etc., and otherwise we're going to have a duel. And so that's what happened. And so I'm just ending here. I'm not ending here, getting close to it. But here is Alexander Hamilton's letter to his wife. And just before the duel. This letter, my dear Eliza, will not be delivered to you unless I shall have terminated my earthly career to begin, as I humbly hope from redeeming grace and divine mercy, a happy immortality. If it had been possible for me to have avoided the interview, my love for you and my precious children would have been alone a decisive motive. But it was not possible without sacrifices which would have rendered me unworthy of your esteem. I need not tell you of the pangs I feel from the idea of quitting you and exposing you to the anguish which I know you would feel. Nor could I dwell on the topic lest it should unman me. The consolations of religion, my beloved, can alone support you, and these you have a right to enjoy. Fly to the bosom of your God and be comforted. With my last idea, I shall cherish the sweet hope of meeting you in a better world. Adieu, my best of wives and best of women. Embrace all my darling children for me. He did, of course, he was killed Alexander Hamilton, and his wife outlived him for 55 decades, and she died at 97 in the 1850s. And here, of course, is the duel, New Jersey, and his tomb at Trinity Church. And there you go. Patriot of an incorruptible integrity, the soldier of approved valor, the statesman of consummate wisdom, whose talents and virtues will be admired. Now, quickly we'll go through the Grange. I hope you'll be enticed a bit to go visit it when you can. Here it is. That's really the only home that he really owned, and they started in 1801 to build the house. And it was much further downtown, and the United States Park Service was to move it up into Harlem. I believe, was it in the early part of this century? You'll have to forgive me if I don't know the exact date when that was done. The hallway in the interior, and looking into some of the major rooms. In that hallway, you'll find this bust of Alexander Hamilton and a famous portrait of Hamilton himself. That was by Giuseppe Goracci, and the painting was by John Trumbull. And these are copies. I'm not sure about the bust, though. Some of the furniture in that hallway, as you can see, that to the right looks like a marble floor. It's actually cloth. It's faux, painted to look like marble, and you could see it there in the hallway. Something that was done quite a bit in those days. Let's see, that is called Ishpo. I guess is that like a potpourri container, 1781. A faux bamboo chair, and then of course there's the floor covering I was just talking about. Some other neoclassical mahogany side table, satinwood, chandelier in the hallway as well. This is the office, as you can see. There you go. The desk, writing desk. I believe that is of the period. I'm not quite sure if it is Alexander Hamilton's originally. Dining room. And this is the drawing room, and Sheraton mahogany pinafore, and that, of course, is to the left. It was given to Alexander Hamilton's daughter, Angelica, by her aunt, Angelica Schuyler. I believe I might remember me mentioning her at the beginning. Let's see. And this is a copy, I believe, of the furnishings, the Louis XVI furnishings that were in the drawing room, Louis XVI style sofa. This is a copy. I believe the chair might be original. And an argon oil lamp and a pendulum mantel clock, and also in the drawing room. And the garden today, or fairly close to today, that's Alexander Hamilton's drawing of the grounds, I believe. He laid it out there on paper and how he wanted it to be done. And it had a circular garden that was recreated based on a sketch drawn by Alexander Hamilton, which I just showed you. And more of the flowers that he enjoyed. Alexander Hamilton asked his gardener to plant hyacinths in the main circular garden in the Grange. And we'll end up by some quotes of Alexander Hamilton. Give all the power to the many, they will oppress the few. Give all the power to the few, they will oppress the many. That shows you the balance in his thoughts. Sure, the few probably should have more power than the common man, but if you give them too much, it'll be oppression. If you give too much power to the common man, to the mass of people, then they'll oppress the men. That was his basic belief. I like this one especially. Those who stand for nothing fall for anything. Hamilton's besetting fear was that American democracy would be spoiled by demagogues who would mouth populist shibboleths to conceal their despotism. That's a direct quote from Alexander Hamilton, not Ron Chernow, but it's in his book. Alexander Hamilton also said, if we must have an enemy at the head of government, let it be one whom we can oppose and for whom we are not responsible. The American Revolution was to succeed because it was undertaken by skeptical men who knew that the same passions that toppled tyrannies could be applied to destructive ends. Now, of course, about the slavery issue, we hold these truths to be self-evident. That, of course, is not Hamilton, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson said he was opposed to slavery all his life, and I guess in the bottom of his heart, that's what he believed, though he was a very big slaveholder. And as you can see here, this was written, I believe, it's 1791. Nobody wishes more than I do to see proofs. This is Jefferson. Nobody wishes more than I do to see such proofs as you exhibit, that nature has given to our black brethren talents equal to those of the other colors of men. So I'd like to believe that the black man was on the same par with intellect, etc., and ability as the white person. But, and he's hoping, he says, that the appearance of want of them is owing merely to the degraded condition of their existence. So he's actually saying it's a possibility that because they are enslaved, and that's the biggest degradation you could just about have, that's perhaps why they are not on the same level as whites. So that's maybe with some people is an ongoing issue. Anyway, that's it.
Alan, we have a question.
Yes.
What is standing on?
Yes.
What is standing on the spot where the Grange was built originally?
Oh, I know I was going to check on that again, and I forgot. It was pretty much downtown. Now it's up in Harlem. I can find out that information and send it to you, or tell you next time. So I have to apologize on that one. Exactly where it was, but it's easy enough to if you Google it, you also can find out. So you'll have to forgive me.
Is it hard to get to the Grange now?
Well, it involves a bus and a train and a bus and then walking a bit. So it is a problem. It can be. So if you want to get there, it takes some effort. Again, I can give you the directions, as a matter of fact, next time on how to do it. So it's an interesting trip, one way or the other.
Lastly, where did Alexander Hamilton become a lawyer? Do you know what school he?
I think he was apprenticed to a lawyer. I think that was the way that you could do it in those days. So it was and I guess passing proof that you are knowledgeable as well. Now, who did that? How they set that up? That's another thing that I would have to look into. But that's a good question. But I know he did it by apprenticeship and did it very quickly within a very short period of time. And then he became a well-known lawyer very quickly. He was a very brilliant man. And that, of course, would have been in New York State.
And the African Free School that you mentioned, was that more than one school, or was it?
I believe that was just one. That was just one school that was set up to do that. The idea, to educate the freed black man was something that the Manumission Society was very interested in, and reading and writing, a trade, so you can get a trade, etc. And so it was very important that education, to a certain extent. Interestingly enough, it was the Methodists in the 18th century, even though they held slaves in the South, who believed that all the enslaved should learn how to read and write because they could read the gospel and know about God and religion. And so they were big on education as well. If you remember correctly, in the South, in the 19th century, it became illegal in most of the southern states to teach an enslaved person to read and write. And if anyone was set free, and many of this, they were supposed to have to leave the state, in whatever state it was they were in. So education was very important as far as to show that the enslaved and the freed can learn to read and write and be just as good as anybody else in uncertain conditions, because that's the manumission society. And also religiously to learn to read the Bible and be enlightened to save your soul.
Well, thank you, Alan. This has been wonderful. And I thank everyone for attending this afternoon's program event. I hope you enjoyed it. And stay tuned for next week's program with Alan, which is Castle Clinton and the Forts of New York Harbor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much and have a good afternoon.
You too. My pleasure.